Would you like to remodel your brain for more resiliency, creativity, and joy? This is Robert Manni, host of Guys Radio. And this week, my special guest is Dawson Church. He's written this book called Bliss Brain. We're going to talk all about it on KCAA in Southern California at 8 p.m. Pacific Time. 102.3, 106.5 FM, 1050 AM. The podcast and my YouTube drop tomorrow. Guys Radio. Thanks for your support. Very special guest today. His name is Dawson Church. He's a PhD and award-winning science writer. He's got 3 best-selling books to his credit. The Genie in Your Genes was his first book to demonstrate that emotions drive gene expression. Mind to Matter showed that the brain creates much of what we think of as objective reality. And the new book that we're going to spend most of the time on today, it's called Bliss Brain. It's a really amazing book, and it demonstrates that peak mental states rapidly remodel the brain for happiness. So we can kind of reframe the software in our subconscious to put us on more of a happiness trail, if you will. Dawson has conducted dozens of clinical trials. He founded the National Institute for Integrative Healthcare to promote groundbreaking new treatments. He shares how to apply the breakthroughs of energy psychology to health and personal performance through the emotional freedom technique, EFT Universe, one of the largest alternative medicine sites on the web, EFTUniverse.com. So it is my pleasure and honor to welcome Dawson Church to Guys Radio. Hello there, Dawson.
Hi, Robert. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Now, you've got these 3 different books. The first one is kind of The Genie in Your Genes, a link between emotions and genetics. Mind to Matter, then, Science of Mental States. And the newest one, Bliss Brain, that we just touched on. But I want to start at the beginning because it seems like, it's a very big coincidence that you had your house burned down and it was a tipping point for your work. I had another guest recently who's doing great work and his house burned down. I had 2 other recent guests who both had surprise surgeries, and I just had an emergency appendectomy that was life-threatening about 2.5 weeks ago. So I'm wondering, and this isn't on the script, so to speak, but do you think that people who are on a specific path during this time of what they talk about, quote-unquote, ascension, are running through these traumatic experiences as part of our growth acceleration?
Well, virtually everyone has traumatic experiences. And in a series of experiments starting in the 1970s at Harvard, the researchers showed that even something as seemingly innocuous as not getting emotional cues from a parent can actually traumatize a young baby. And so it's not just the car crash or doing military service and seeing dead bodies that can traumatize you, give you PTSD. Even seemingly very small things like a lack of parental attention can result in traumatic cues in the brain. And so what we have to learn to do is have resilience, and that's the crucial thing. And in Bliss Brain, I talk about groups of people like these Franciscan nuns who spend 25,000 hours in contemplation, Tibetan monks who spend 10,000 hours in meditation. And what people don't often realize is these are often traumatized people. These are people who may have been driven from their homes, they may have been refugees, they may have been tortured. And so that seems to produce those difficult traumatic events in resilient people actually produce what I talk about in the book, they produce post-traumatic growth, not post-traumatic stress disorder. And you actually use these adverse events in life as catalysts for growth. So yes, absolutely, for people who are in a spiritual practice, for people who are seeking an elevated state, you actually use difficult things like the wildfire that burns down your home, your mortgage being underwater, the divorce, whatever it might be. Those can actually, the pressure and the energy of those can catalyze further growth.
Mm-hmm. Now, as a advanced clinical master hypnotist, we would work with some couple of things. One is somebody, let's say they were afraid of water. They didn't know why. Obviously, they weren't born being afraid of water. And then when we would do a regression, we'd find out like, oh, okay, you were flailing around in the pool that day and mommy was sipping a martini talking to the lifeguard and she didn't notice. And that experience made you afraid of water. And then the trauma from that can be then embedded in your organs and your subconscious and kind of stored there. And you have to find, there's ways to get that out of you. Does that make sense, Dawson?
Oh, definitely. And people often feel a vague sense of unease that things weren't right in their bodies, in their lives, without being able to pinpoint what those events are. And so for people who had the car crash, for people who had the sexual abuse or the physical abuse or the bullying, they can point to an event and say, it was that triggered my post-traumatic stress. But for many of us, there are these things that we bury in our muscles, bury in our subconscious that happened a long time ago. And for example, a 2-year-old who is not getting his or her needs met or who's being abused, they don't have the vocabulary to explain this or the same brain pathways to memorize this that an but nonetheless, those experiences are locked in their muscles, locked in their bodies. We call those trauma capsules in PTSD research. And so often in that trauma capsule, everything that happened back then is locked and coded by the body and the brain in that cocoon. And inside of that, all that suffering exists. So as children, these trauma capsules were highly adaptive. We needed to deal with our abusive family, our parents, our brothers, our sisters, bad things going on in the world. And so we buried them. And that made perfect sense when you were 5. If you're still doing that and dissociating and burying trauma capsules when you're 55, then you've missed a big chance to grow and heal. So the work of being an adult is to go face your past, use these amazing advanced healing tools I talk about in Bliss Brain and my other books, and actually go and approach and learn to deal with and pull up those old traumatic events. And what the research shows is it's crystal clear that you can heal a traumatic past. You don't have to keep on dragging this stuff with you day after day, week after week, because it's producing really adverse effects in your body. The adverse childhood experiences study at Kaiser showed that people who don't heal their past have higher rates of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, hepatitis, obesity, all kinds of things. So it's really essential to find the tools and then go and pull out those traumatic events, work with them, and release that traumatic stress.
Do you think, Dawson, that some of these experience could come from even our karmic or come from past lives, or you don't get into that?
I don't get into that because it's not provable, and all my books are evidence-based. They're just what the evidence shows us is possible. But whatever the explanatory framework, and so, for example, if you believe in karma or past lives, that can be your explanatory framework for how you feel right now.
Mm-hmm.
And we teach people in our training and certification programs that doesn't matter if that's objectively true, and the answer is no. The answer is it subjectively and therapeutically useful? And if you want to believe in a past life, if you want to believe in karma, if you want to believe in whatever your spiritual tradition is, that's great. If you don't, if you're an atheist, I mean, the research shows that atheists have as high a proportion of experiences like clairvoyance and telepathy and psychokinesis and distant healing as these are just part of the human experience. So you don't have to believe in those things, and you can heal regardless of your framework.
Got it. Okay, let's take a half step back. The name of the new book is called Bliss Brain, the Neuroscience of Remodeling Your Brain for Resilience, Creativity, and Joy. Now, tell us about the path from your first book, The Genie in Your Genes, to Mind to Matter, to Bliss Brain. And the kind of inciting incident on Bliss Brain is your house burned down, and it created a whole series of changes for you. So let's take a step back to bring ourselves forward.
Yeah, well, Genie in Your Genes was my first sort of huge breakthrough idea. And there was a lot of research on epigenetics that got going in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And research showed that factors like belief and altruism, compassion, were changing things like the levels of stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, and neurotransmitters in your brain. So here we had invisible states of consciousness literally producing molecular changes in the body. Now, just step back and think about how remarkable it is that you change your thoughts and you literally have a shift in function of your body. You're changing your levels of hormones and neurotransmitters. And what I then reasoned was that we must therefore be changing the expression of our genes, turning genes on, turning genes off. And there was no experimental proof of that back in 2005 when I wrote the book. But by the time I wrote the second edition in 2013, there were 12 studies showing that emotions affect gene expression. By the following edition, 2015, there were hundreds of studies showing that our inner states literally are turning genes on and off. In one of the studies in the book, we showed that an hour of acupressure tapping on acupressure points changed the expression of 72 genes. And randomized controlled trial with veterans, we showed that 6 sessions of that same therapy literally were dialing up genes that suppress inflammation and promote immunity. So we now have experimental proof from dozens of studies that the states of consciousness are literally turning genes on and off. And so the Gene in Your Genes is all about what those states are, and 12 evidence-based practices you can use in your own life that will shift you in those ways. Then I went to Mind to Matter, and that book was more or less, it began just as a lighthearted exploration of, do our minds really affect material reality? I mean, how true is this whole idea that as you change your thoughts, the external world changes? Obviously, when I change my thoughts, my internal world changes and my hormones and neurotransmitters change, but does it change the outside world? And there's such a body of fascinating evidence that shows that as you change your thinking, you literally are shifting the configuration of molecules around you. One example is, right, you took a sip of water a minute ago, I'm taking one right now. And in some amazing experiments, the researchers showed that the water molecule literally shifts its bonding angle when there's intention going into it. And so the water molecule is a very simple molecule, one big oxygen, 2 little hydrogen atoms, H2O, and the angle of that bond is 104 degrees. It just never is affected by whether the water is liquid or gas. So the water's always got that same stable molecular angle. But when you take, say, for example, a healing touch practitioner and have them bless that water, the bonding angle changes. When you take that blessed water and water plants with it, those plants grow stronger and bigger and have more chlorophyll compared to those watered with identical water that's not been treated. So we are literally in various ways changing the outside world. In one amazing experiment, the researchers were looking at mice with cancer and having a healer send healing intention to a group of mice in one lab and not in another. And then the way the experiment worked was that at random intervals, the researcher would get a little beep on his cell phone. He'd send healing intention to these mice only in the one room for about 20 minutes or so. And the researchers had a device measuring the electromagnetic field of the earth, of the room, right below both cages of mice. In the control group, in a distant building, nothing changed about the field. In the experimental group, during that 20 minutes and only during those random intervals, did that field change, and it changed by 20%. So intention was associated with a change of 20% in the actual literal electromagnetic field of life in that room. So it's remarkable what we can do with our minds. And there are all kinds of stories in the book about people healing cancer, about people making money, about people doing all kinds of things in the outside world purely on the basis of changes of mind.
Okay. All right. Before we move into Bliss Brain, I just want 2 points on the first 2 books. One is, it sounds like, which I believe, that people are creating their lives moment by moment, and the present is all that counts. And with the power of intention, it has amazing implications and powerful implications to what we experience, what we see, what we send out there, and it can affect a lot of things. The other thing is that emotional freedom technique. For our listeners, if you could just give a quick summary what that is, because it's a very simple practice of tapping, and how people can use that without going into too deep of a dive. But it is an important, very simple practice that anybody can use. And of course, I'm not suggesting people who are listening out there, if you're driving or something, don't start tapping, but you can learn a lot more about it. Dawson's going to tell us where we can get more information. But it's effective and it's simple.
It's effective, and it's been shown to be effective in over 100 clinical trials. And it's simply thinking about the bad stuff. So you want to think about whatever traumatic trigger there is, a memory, a belief, an idea, a current situation in your life, a future feared outcome, and then you stimulate your acupuncture meridians. And these are meridians that run through your body. They're easily measurable by various devices. And by tapping on them, you alter the energy flows. And so just the way an acupuncturist puts a needle in and unblocks the energy by tapping, you do the same thing. So research now shows that when you do this, the emotional parts of the brain, the hippocampus, the amygdala, all of the emotional limbic system components of the brain calm down. In one MRI study, people were tested before and after tapping. And before tapping, their emotional midbrains were highly lit up by certain cues. After tapping, they weren't. So tapping literally shuts down the emotional responses in the brain, and you then just have your life minus all that negative emotion you otherwise would have. And it makes a huge difference. Like one veteran I worked with, he had a terrible set of experiences as a medic in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
His very first week, he had to recover the remains of a friend of his who'd been killed, and he had to clean the uniform of all the blood and body fluids of his friend. And you just can't imagine. I mean, this guy's triggering was just through the roof. As he remembered the event, he had to literally stand outside the hut he was doing this in, run inside with the bleach, clean a little bit of the uniform, and run outside for a breath of fresh air. He was so triggered by this. And then after tapping the next day, he could tell the whole story. Now, he had all the compassion for his friend there. He had all the positive emotion. He just was no longer triggered by the negative emotion. And we've now got dozens of clinical trials showing that this works. That, in a nutshell, is what it does. It removes the negative emotion that we associate with a memory.
So how often, and then we'll move on to Bliss Brain, I promise, does somebody need to do that, depending, I guess, on how traumatic the situation or incident was? How often does somebody need to do tapping? And would you recommend that people tap every day, just make it a standard practice?
Whenever you're stressed. And I recommend both meditation and tapping, because meditation brings you to a good baseline early in the morning. Especially early morning meditation brings you to this feeling of pretty high well-being. Then when you're stressed during the day and you lose that sense of well-being, that's when you tap. Or when you have a memory or a thought or a belief that pulls you out of that sense of well-being, that's when you tap. So whatever it is that triggers you, that's when you use tapping.
Got it. Okay. My special guest on Guys Radio is Dawson Church, PhD, Bliss Brain, the neuroscience of remodeling your brain for resilience, creativity, and joy. So take us through your journey that led you to this very important book. And I know things started out with your house burning down.
Yeah, and that was a terrible day for my wife and I. She woke me up in the middle of the night. It was 12:45 a.m. I looked at the alarm clock, was blinking 12:45. I looked out. She said, something's really wrong. Window, there was this glow on the horizon. I walked out onto the deck outside our bedroom, and this wildfire was just sweeping down the adjoining valley toward the hilltop where we lived. And so I just yelled, we're getting out of here right now. We ran through the house, grabbed the car keys and our cell phones, sprinted for the car. And then as we drove out, she looked up because she felt all this heat on the top of her head. She looked up from the moonroof, and all the branches were on fire above her head. We got out of there just in the nick of time. And again, we lost everything, all our possessions. Our office building was on the same property that burned down. And so suddenly we found ourselves in this state of, having to deal with the fire and its aftermath. We were dazed, we were confused, we had all the symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And it took us about 2 years to really get back on our feet again. And so we used meditation. And I'll never forget the second day after the fire. I woke up that morning and I said to my wife, Christine, I said, darling, this is an emergency. We have to meditate right now. And as we meditated that morning in a hotel room a long way away from the fires, as we meditated, we literally felt ourselves drop into our bodies. And Robert, this may seem incredible, but after the meditation, we began to joke about some of the stuff we had in the house that we hated. There were things we didn't like there. And it's like, Well, we don't have to worry about those anymore. Like I had several repairs I was supposed to make on the house, and I turned to her and said, I don't have to make those repairs anymore. I texted the manager, our office manager who ran our business, and the office had burned down and there's nothing left. And we got the photographs back from people who photographed the property, and they showed a concrete slab and a layer of ash on top, and that was all that was left. So I texted the office manager who's seen these pictures as well. And I said, Heather, we've had this goal for the last